We're back with a brand new series here on Top 5 Scary Videos. This is It Came From the 80's, a series where we examine the greatest horrors from the decade and why they became so iconic in the world of cinema. So what better place to begin than with the master of horror himself, Wes Craven, and his terrifying 80's classic, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Let's just jump right in. Released in 1984, A Nightmare on Elm Street is a slasher directed and written by Wes Craven himself, an iconic horror director famous for works such as The Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, and Swamp Thing. He had quite the impressive resume already before even stepping foot on Elm Street, the location of this terrifying tale. Now, in order to examine the film and how exactly it became such an iconic film, we must first know what it's about. A Nightmare on Elm Street is the first installment in a lengthy series and follows 4 teenagers living on one street in the fictitious town of Springwood, Ohio, who were invaded and killed in their dreams, and thus killed in reality, by a burnt killer with a bladed leather glove, Freddy Krueger. Freddy is introduced as a child killer with the aforementioned glove, which was crafted in a boiler room where he used to take his victims. He is eventually captured by a group of parents and cornered in the boiler room, dousing Freddy in gasoline and setting him ablaze, and thus burning him alive. However, while his body died, his spirit lived on in the dreams of a group of teenagers, more specifically the children of those who took his life. As opposed to most heroes of modern cinema, think Dirty Harry, Indiana Jones, even Rambo, Freddy is a villain, a truly despicable entity that conforms to nothing less than the ethos of hell itself. Yet, since 1984, he has become celebrated and the subject of popular rap songs by even Fat Boys and DJ Jazzy Jeff, even the Fresh Prince. So why is that? Well, from the off, there is something inherently terrifying about an entity that invades your dreams. Sleep is our solitude, and dreaming is something that is so uniquely ours. So to have someone or something invade that space and break down your walls with a bladed glove, well, that's absolutely horrifying. In a way, it feels as though Freddy's newfound hipness isn't a way of celebrating a killer, but instead diminishing the evil, and in turn, the fear, making the fiend far less frightening, because Freddy will always remain neither humorous nor heroic. Portrayed by Robert Englund, the actor once stated, I quote, "After all, Freddy is a child killer, a kind of modern monster that we have seen and heard a lot about in recent years, but in a way he's a symbol of even something worse. Although I don't play abstracts as an actor, I think that what Freddy really stands for is the idea of killing the future. He has no place there, and so he is killing it. He has an envy of youth, and when teenagers see these movies, I'm sure that's what really freaks them out and scares them. Even though they may not intellectualize it, they understand that's what Freddy is truly stalking, their future hopes." Initially, Krueger was intended to be a child molester, but Craven eventually characterized him as a child murderer to avoid being accused of exploiting highly publicized child molestation cases that were occurring around the same time. Director Wes Craven stated, I quote, "In a sense, Freddy stands for the worst of parenthood and adulthood, the dirty old man, the nasty father, and the adult who wants children to die rather than help them prosper. He's the boogeyman and the worst fear of children, the adult that's out to get them. He's a very primal figure, sort of like Kronos devouring his children, that evil, twisted, perverted father figure that wants to destroy and is able to get them at their most vulnerable moment, which is when they're asleep." Craven strove to differ Krueger from the rest of cinema's iconic villains, with the majority of them wearing masks, including Leatherface, Michael Myers, and Jason. Craven stated, I quote, "I wanted my villain to have a mask, but be able to talk and taunt and threaten, so I thought of him being burned and scarred. However, it is Freddy's glove that became the most iconic part of the character, with Craven finding that knives were far too common in horror movies, so he considered a glove with steak knives, thus creating the iconic weapon for our favorite villain." Now, A Nightmare on Elm Street contains many biographical elements from Wes Craven's own childhood, but don't fret, there was no entity lurking in his dreams. Instead, the movie was inspired inspired by several newspaper articles printed in the LA Times in the 1970s about a group of Southeast Asian refugees who, after fleeing to the US, suffered disturbing nightmares and refused to sleep. Some of the men even died in their sleep soon after. Doctors called the strange phenomenon Asian death syndrome, which seemed to afflict men between the ages of 19 and 57, and was believed to be sudden unexplained death syndrome or Brugada syndrome. However, that was just the start. The 1970s pop song Dreamweaver was what finished off the story for Craven, giving him not only a setting, but also a synthesizer riff for the movie soundtrack. Tracking back to Freddy, the villain was actually drawn from Craven's early life. One night, a young Craven saw an old man walking on the sidewalk outside the window of his home. The man stopped, glanced at Craven and walked off. This very small interaction served as the inspiration for Freddy Krueger. Now what's quite surprising is the sheer amount of studios that initially passed on the project, simply because of its similarity to Dreamscape, a film being produced by Paramount Pictures at the time. Universal Studios also passed, and in the midst of all the rejection and financial strain, Craven framed the letter on the wall of his office. However, finally the independent New Line Cinema Corporation stepped forward and agreed to produce the film. God bless. The film initially premiered in the US with a limited theatrical release on November 9, 1984, opening in 165 cinemas across the country and grossing $1.2 million during its opening weekend, instantly making it a commercial success. In total, the film made $25.5 million at the American box office and won a slew of awards in the process, and to this day is considered one of the greatest horror movies of all time, resulting in 9 sequels, including Freddy's Revenge, Dream Warriors, The Dream Master, and even a Friday the 13th crossover in Freddy vs. Jason. It was pretty damn iconic. However, tracking back to the original film that started it all, of course, when you make a film, you can't please everyone, and you certainly can't please everyone when making a horror film. When the film was submitted to the Motion Picture Association of America film rating system, they required 2 cuts to grant it an R rating. The theatrical version was released with an R rating and 13 seconds of cuts. The uncut version wouldn't see the light of day in the United States until the 1996 release. However, all DVD, digital and Blu-ray releases use the R-rated theatrical version. The uncut version has yet to be released on a digital platform. A Nightmare on Elm Street was a dark, smart horror film and created an everlasting legacy in the horror genre that cannot be touched. I mean, this is a fact. People have tried. They even released 2010's Nightmare on Elm Street, which was mediocre, formulaic, and did not live up to its predecessor's legacy. It made money, yes, but it also crashed and burned in the process. And one of the many reasons for this was Robert Englund's departure after an irreplaceable performance as the franchise's icon. However, we're not discussing mediocrity here, we're discussing a masterpiece. The 1984 classic will forever remain one of the greatest pieces of cinema, and a trailblazer in the slasher genre, just behind Halloween of course. I mean, Freddy has less than 10 minutes of screen time in the first A Nightmare on Elm Street, stalking in the shadows, peeking out behind walls, and his sharp knives dragging across metal. The effectiveness of horror is what you don't see. If you need to shove your villain at any given opportunity, then you're failing before you even begin. And that's what makes Wes Craven an incredible director, and A Nightmare on Elm Street an 80s classic, because what scares us is simply going to sleep. Freddy wields unfathomable power, and he could literally be hiding anywhere. When you're asleep, he controls your reality, making no place in the world safe for you. Where are you supposed to hide if you can't even close your eyes? In the wrong hands, Freddy could be silly, but with the collaboration between Craven and Englund, we have something truly eerie and terrifying. Well, there we have it. What are your thoughts on our new series, It Came From the 80s? Which classic film would you like us to tackle next? Leave us all your thoughts and feelings in the comments down below. If you haven't already, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another scary vid. And until next time, see you later. Welcome back to It Came From the 80s, the new series where we dissect some of the greatest horror movies to come out of the 1980s and why they became the classics that they did. So today on Top 5 Scary Videos, this is It Came From the 80s, this time with Friday the 13th, a highly demanded film that I can't wait to examine. Before we begin though, be sure to stick around until the end of the video where I'll be responding to some of your comments. So let's jump in. Friday the 13th was released back in 1980 and directed by Sean S. Cunningham, who outside of Friday the 13th was known for little else, with films like The Art of Marriage, Case of the Full Moon Murders, and A Stranger is Watching occupying space on his resume. The film itself tells the story of a group of teenage camp counselors who are murdered one by an unknown killer while they attempt to reopen an abandoned summer camp. Now, Friday the 13th was initially prompted by the success of John Carpenter's Halloween, with Sean S. Cunningham putting out an advertisement to sell his film in early 1979, while Victor Miller, the writer, was still drafting the screenplay. Cunningham took a lot of his cues when going into the film from Wes Craven, our last topic of conversation, with Cunningham having worked with the filmmaker on The Last House on the Left. Inspired by Halloween, Cunningham wanted Friday the 13th to be shocking, visually stunning, and a film that would make audience members jump out of their seats. Now, the original screenplay was tentatively titled A Long Night at Camp Blood. However, when working on redrafts, Cunningham proposed the title Friday the 13th. But of course, he had a fear that someone may have already owned the rights, prompting Cunningham to commission a New York advertising agency to develop the concept of the Friday the 13th logo, which consisted of big block letters bursting through a pane of glass. An iconic image for an iconic movie. By mid-1979, Victor Miller had completed the screenplay and of course was over the moon at the idea that he had created a serial killer who would turn out to be somebody's mother, a murderer whose only motivation was to love and protect her child. I quote, "I took motherhood and turned it on its head, and I think that was great fun. Mrs. Voorhees was the mother I'd always wanted, a mother who would have killed for her kids." Saying that though, as we know in future sequels, the franchise was ultimately changed so that Jason Voorhees was the killer, something that Miller did not agree with. I quote, "Jason was dead from the very beginning. He was a victim, not a villain." Preach, Victor, preach. Now, of course, in the first Friday the 13th, Jason made a haunting cameo at the end of the movie, a scene which was not initially used in the original script, with Miller's final draft actually ending with Alice merely floating on the lake, without Jason emerging from the water to attack her. Jason's appearance came about after a suggestion from makeup designer Tom Savini, who stated, "The whole reason for the cliffhanger at the end was I had just seen Carrie, so we thought we needed a chair jumper like that, and I said, let's bring in Jason." Now, the film was of course a success nonetheless, with it going on to spark 11 more sequels, including a crossover with our previous horror movie villain, Freddy Krueger, in the iconic movie Freddy vs. Jason. What a classic. Now, after seeing the later titles in the franchise, going back to watch the original can be a little surprising. It's tamer than you would expect, with little gore and hardly any nudity, and of course, there's no hockey mask. If you're in search of a hockey mask wearing killer, you actually need to fast forward to the second sequel, where we get our first real appearance from Jason. Well, the killer Jason, not the drowned boy. Now, as previously stated, Halloween began the slasher genre, but it can be said that it took Friday the 13th to pave the road. Although the film itself isn't the best, with characters that are paper thin and the story existing entirely as an excuse for carnage, it was instead Jason which made the franchise such a success. And of course, above all else, the first film actually wasn't even scary. In parts it was atmospheric, yes, but that was simply down to the low-key style, because of money. Now let's talk about Jason. Jason, as aforementioned, would become the series' flagship killer. However, he would not make his first real appearance until part 2. He lives primarily in the backstory and appears in a dream sequence, but other than that, he's not relevant to the events at Camp Crystal Lake, until the end of the movie that is, and more importantly, he is not the killer. A quote from the movie goes like this: "There's a legend around here, a killer buried but not dead, a curse on Crystal Lake, a death curse, Jason Voorhees' curse. They say he died as a boy but he keeps coming back. Few have seen him and lived, some have even tried to stop him. No one can. People forget he's down there, waiting." Now, moving forward in the franchise, this statement held true. Following the events of the first movie and after having witnessed his mother's murder spree, Jason, also having witnessed his mother's death, grabbed her sweater, pants, severed head, and the machete that killed her, and returned to his shack with them, placing the objects on a crude altar he had constructed. This is what would kickstart his murderous rampage, beginning in the summer of 1984, when a brand new group of teenagers occupied the nearby Packanack Lodge. Now, I won't go into too many details because I don't want to spoil the movie for any of you. What I can say about Jason though is that he has superhuman strength that is shown in part 2, where he is shown to have enhanced strength capable of impaling victims with ease, as well as breaking out a window with one single shot. He also has pain resistance, stealth, intelligence, revenant zombie physiology, supernatural strength, immortality, regeneration, resurrection, supernatural durability, teleportation, and finally, weapons proficiency. The latter being incredibly important in the later movies. For example, part 2, where he used an ice pick, barbed wire, a tree, hammer, machete, spear, knife, pitchfork, and a pickaxe. Yeah, Jason loves his weapons. Now, some trivia for you Friday the 13th lovers out there. Did you know that Jason has the most kills out of any other horror film slasher, with his total number being around 151? So now you know all the details. How exactly was the film such a success? Firstly, upon release back on May 9th, 1980, the film earned approximately $5.8 million in its opening weekend, before finishing domestically with $39 million, making it the 18th highest grossing film of that year, putting it in direct competition with The Shining, Dressed to Kill, The Fog, and Prom Night. Now, the critical response was of course mixed, with Linda Gross of the LA Times referring to it as, I quote, a silly, boring, youth-geared horror movie. However, she did praise the musical score. Many compared the movie unfavorably against Halloween and stated that the film was minimal on plot, suspense, and characterization. However, its legacy certainly speaks for itself. Friday the 13th was what initiated the subgenre of the stalker or slasher film, and in turn instigated a rush of films to follow in its footsteps. The film, though panned, has attained a significant cult following over the years, and in 2017, Complex ranked the film 9th on a list of the best slasher films of all time. As a standalone movie, Friday the 13th is unremarkable and easily forgettable. However, the same words cannot be said to describe its impact upon cinema as a whole. If Halloween created the slasher, Friday the 13th is definitely its offspring. Without this franchise, the face of horror would be drastically different. And though opinions may vary, you can't discredit the impact the entire franchise had on the horror genre as a whole, because what Friday the 13th does right is that it takes the real world of the 1980s and demonstrates to teens that they can survive it, given the right set of skills. Respect. Well, there we have it. That was our breakdown of Friday the 13th. What film would you like us to tackle next on It Came From the 80s? Leave us all your thoughts and feelings in the comments down below. Before I go though, I just want to respond to a few comments from one of our last videos, Top 5 Scary Korean Urban Legends. Sardeth Kingfire said, 312, Lucy is possessed, confirmed. That was actually me laughing, but good to know you guys can't handle that. Duly noted. Bobby McGrother said, Lucy, be my friend or don't. I mean, do what you want, I'm not your dad. Wait, you're not? What a disappointment. He never did return from the store when he went to get milk. Thorin693 said, dressed in white and long hair, is Lucy a virgin ghost? I can confirm that I am definitely not. Again, that's dad, look away. And on that note, if you haven't already, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another scary vid. And until next time, see you later. The Evil Dead was written and directed by the incredible Sam Raimi back in 1981 and is to this day one of the greatest horror films of all time. Starred at the time an unknown Bruce Campbell, Ellen Sandweiss, and Betsy Baker. Now, the film itself focuses on 5 college students vacationing in an isolated cabin in a remote wooded area, and after they find an audio tape that, when played, releases a legion of demons and spirits, members of the group suffer from demonic possession, leading to increasingly gory mayhem. It's an iconic film that has gone on to influence some of the greatest in the business, from Peter Jackson to even Edgar Wright. The film was such a success it spawned a 2013 remake and 2 sequels, Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness. Now, what's more surprising is the budget of the movie versus the box office profit. The movie cost between $350,000 to $400,000 and raked in a whopping $2.4 million, which for an indie horror is huge. Raimi, Bruce Campbell, and producer Robert Tapert fought incredibly hard through no CGI, sticky blood made from everyday household items, and of course through the reluctance of major studios to get on board to make a cult classic. I bet they have regrets now. Now, the film was initially based on Sam Raimi's short film, Within the Woods, a 30-minute Super 8 film which starred Bruce Campbell again. In a 1982 interview, Raimi stated, I quote, "We used Within the Woods to show investors what kind of film they'd be buying into. They needed tangible proof that we could make a movie of professional quality. And that they did. I mean, just look at The Evil Dead now. An interesting nugget of information for you movie buffs out there. Did you know? Before becoming the Oscar-winning filmmaker duo Joel and Ethan Coen, Joel got his start as an assistant editor on The Evil Dead, and inspired by Raimi's DIY filmmaking, Joel and Ethan created a pitch trailer to raise money for their first feature, Blood Simple. The more you know. Now back to The Evil Dead. The film was a hardship for most of the cast and crew, with it being filmed in an actual cabin in Morristown, Tennessee, secluded from the nearby town. Bruce Campbell detailed to DVD Talk among the many hellish situations the cast and crew dealt with were diving into freezing cold swamps and Raimi getting chased by a bull. I quote, "We were going to rural Tennessee, 1979, where there's moonshine, squatters, and it was the real deal. The South was the South in 1979. There was no franchise this or franchise that. It was a completely different world and mentality. We used real ammunition in the shotgun and we shot it at a real cabin in the woods, with hunters and howling dogs in the background. The shoot was such a grueling process that even director Sam Raimi worked himself so hard he passed out during filming." At Spooky Empire's reunion, Bart Pierce, who did visual effects for the film, noted how much the filming took a toll on Raimi. The story goes that Raimi fainted during the shooting of the film's dismemberment scene. He had stayed up all night shooting and wrote all day. In order to even wake up in the mornings, the crew took an ice bucket of water and threw it onto him until he gained consciousness. Now, spookier still, the cabin in which they shot in has its very own spooky backstory. During an interview with John Gallagher, Raimi recounted a horror story involving 3 generations of women who previously occupied the cabin. I quote, "One night during a thunderstorm, this little girl woke up and was scared by the lightning happening around the cabin. She ran into her mother's room and, pulling back the covers, climbing into bed with her, she found that her mother was dead. She was so frightened she ran into her grandmother's room, and somehow that same evening, she had died also. The little girl ran into the storm to this little farmhouse and was found screaming and banging on the doors. The family there took care of her after that, and no one lived in the cabin since. The little girl, who's now an old woman, during thunderstorms after that, would often be found wandering around the woods. However, the kicker is that the story came to life during filming, with Raimi going on to state, I quote, "As we were shooting, this fellow was looking for the woman, saying that because there was a thunderstorm the night before, he was looking for the woman because it was possible she had returned to the cabin. As far as we know, they never found her." Wow. That's absolutely terrifying. Better yet, because the film had such a low budget, everything you saw in it was real. I mean, aside from the infamous tree scene, of course. Bruce Campbell has said before, everything was real during filming. I quote, "The illegal substance known as marijuana was somehow forced upon us in Tennessee. I was forced to ingest this marijuana by a local reprobate, and I therefore became, let's just say, affected by THC. I therefore lost any sense of time and where I was, and that's the time that Sam Raimi decided that he needed to shoot Ash having a breakdown." Classic. It's beginning to sound less forced and more planned, in my opinion. Despite this, upon release, the film was met with rave reviews, even by the king of horror himself, Stephen King, calling it, I quote, "the most ferociously original film of the year," which in turn allowed it to secure an international distributor, New Line Cinema, who at the time was relatively unknown. Now, of course, like a lot of low-budget horror films, censorship came into play. Because of its graphic violence, specifically a tree rape scene, the original version of the movie was banned in several countries, including Finland, Germany, Iceland, and Ireland, with many describing the tree rape as being misogynistic. However, a heavily edited version was made legally available in 1992, and in 2001 an uncut German DVD version was released. Back to the tree rape though. As said before, the initial release of the film was met with a lot of backlash for its extreme violence, excessive blood, and of course the scene in which Cheryl is assaulted by a tree, causing uproar among viewers and critics. However, did you know? Raimi himself regrets the scene. I bet he does. I quote, "It was unnecessarily gratuitous and a little too brutal. My goal was not to offend people. My judgment was a little wrong at the time." Preach. Too much moonshine. Like most cult classics, the film over time has garnered more and more popular votes, with its current rating on Rotten Tomatoes displaying a very impressive 95%. With Empire stating, "This classic low-budget horror film combines just the right amount of gore and black humor, giving The Evil Dead an equal amount of thrills and laughs." Now, while it did receive favorable reviews, it failed to establish Raimi's reputation. However, it was a box office success, which led to Raimi and Campbell teaming up once again for another movie. Yet still, nothing sparked. Thankfully though, Raimi had studio support to make a sequel to The Evil Dead, which he decided to make out of desperation, yet has become equally as popular as the first. Evil Dead 2 was released in 1987, and a second sequel in 1993 called Army of Darkness, with Campbell returning as the lead, Ash Williams, in both films. Evil Dead 2 received critical acclaim and is often considered to be better than the original movie. Evil Dead and its sequels have become one of the largest cult film trilogies in history. The film ultimately launched the careers of both Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell, who have since collaborated together frequently, virtually in every single film. Campbell's role as Ash in Evil Dead was defining, often being compared to roles ranging from his performance of Elvis Presley in the film Bubba Hotep to the Demon in the X-Files episode Terms of Endearment. The Evil Dead has in turn spawned a media empire, with a video game adaptation of the same name being made for the Commodore 64 in 1984, as well as a trilogy of survival horror games in the 1990s and early 2000s. Evil Dead, Hail to the King, Evil Dead, A Fistful of Boomstick, and Evil Dead Regeneration. The character Ash even became the main character of a comic book franchise, which saw him fight both Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees in the Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash series, and in January 2008, Dark Horse Comics began releasing a 4-part monthly comic book miniseries written by Mark Verheiden and drawn by John Bolton based on The Evil Dead. Better yet, the film even inspired a stage musical aptly titled Evil Dead the Musical, which was produced with permission of Raimi and Campbell and has been running since 2003. In 2015, an ongoing television continuation of the films called Ash vs. Evil Dead premiered on the Starz network, with Sam Raimi writing and directing the pilot and served as the executive producer, and of course, Campbell reprised his role as Ash during the 3 seasons it was on the air. However, bad news for the folks looking to visit the set of this iconic cult classic. After the release of the film, many people began trespassing onto the filming location in Morristown. In 1982, the cabin was burned down by drunken trespassers. Although the cabin is gone, the chimney remains, which many people now take stones from. This is why we can't have nice things. Now, of course, like all great things, a terrible human being came along in 2013 and remade The Evil Dead. Now, I shouldn't be too hard on it because it actually wasn't that bad. It was actually pretty good. The film was even produced by Raimi and Campbell and has an approval rating of 62% on Rotten Tomatoes, with critics saying, I quote, "It may lack the absurd humor that underlined the original, but the new look Evil Dead compensates with brutal terror, gory scenes, and gleefully bloody violence. It's definitely worth your time." Well, there we have it. Are you an Evil Dead fan? What other 80s classics would you like us to cover on It Came From the 80s? Leave us all your thoughts and feelings in the comments down below. Before I go though, I just want to respond to a few comments from one of our last videos, Top 5 Scary Cursed Games You Should Never Play Part 2. Jazzy said, "Hi random person scrolling down the comments, I hope you have a good day, and I hope it's the best day of your life. I know this will get lost fast though." It did not get lost. That's very sweet. Hope you also have an incredible day. Kirk Morrison said, "Can I just play Risk instead? It seems to be safer." Safer for you perhaps, but not if I'm playing. Nobody survives if I'm playing. I've killed people. Cut that out. They might believe me. Jackie G said, "Lucy, where did you get your sweater? It looks cozy. I would trust a wreck from someone who lived in 2 cold countries." I believe I got it from Topshop. It was a while ago though, so don't take my word for it. I also don't even remember what sweater I'm wearing in the video you're talking about, so probably Topshop. DC Carter said, "Lucy, we can't let Joss do any more scary tier lists. Watch the last one and see if you agree. Halloween remake was hot trash. I bring this to you because I trust your opinion." Oh, believe me, I saw it. I even edited that video. Me and Joss have battles daily about her taste in not just horror films, but films in general. She's here right now. Yes. We will never agree, but we all have different opinions, I guess. Mine is just the right one. And on that note, if you haven't already, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another scary vid. And until next time, see you later. Directed by the absolute legend John Carpenter, The Thing was released back in 1982 and is a science fiction horror based on the 1938 novella Who Goes There, written by John W. Campbell Jr. The Thing tells the story of a group of American researchers in Antarctica who encounter the Thing, a parasitic extraterrestrial life form that assimilates then imitates other organisms. In turn, the group is overcome with paranoia and conflict as they learn that they can no longer trust each other and that one of them could in fact be the Thing. Now, it may surprise you to know that this classic movie was released to very negative reviews and was described as instant junk, a wretched excess, and was perhaps one of the most hated films of all time at that specific time. Now, although folks praised its advanced special effects, others criticized the repulsiveness of the overall film and focused on its poor characterization. The Thing cost $15 million to make and made $19.6 million at the box office, just breaking even. For those of us who love The Thing, this may all sound quite shocking. However, many reasons people have cited it as a failure was because of its direct competition with Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which, like The Thing, also offered its take on alien visitation. However, E.T.'s was friendlier and kid-friendly. However, everything changed for the better when The Thing was released on home video and television, and in turn finally finding its audience. Viewers finally praised the film, classifying it as one of the greatest science fiction movies and horror movies the world has ever seen. And as of right now, the film has one of the largest cult followings of any movie. Now let's delve back, way back to where it all began. Development of The Thing began in the mid-1970s when producers David Foster and Lawrence Terman suggested an adaptation of John Campbell's aforementioned novella to Universal Pictures. It had, as very few know, been loosely adapted previously by Howard Hawks in his movie The Thing from Another World, in turn making The Thing somewhat of a remake. However, both Foster and Terman wanted to develop a film that stuck more closely to the source material. Now, at the time the film was in pre-production, John Carpenter was mainly known as an independent film director, surprisingly so. So saying that, instead Universal approached Tobe Hooper, known for directing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, released in 1974. However, producers weren't sold on Hooper and his writing partner's concept for the film, and after several failed pitches and attempts to bring aboard other directors, the film was put on hold. However, thanks to Ridley Scott's 1979 horror, Alien, the project was revitalized, with Carpenter becoming loosely attached following his huge success with the influential horror Halloween, released in 1978. Now, although most of what I said is surprising, what's more surprising is that Carpenter was reluctant to even join the movie in the first place, believing that it would be far too difficult to make anything close to as good as the original monster film. However, what ultimately changed his mind was a producer suggesting he read the original novella, which he did, and in turn discovered the creepiness of the imitations conducted by the creature and the questions it raised, so of course he signed on. Filming for The Thing began on August 24, 1981 in Juneau, Alaska, and lasted approximately 12 weeks, and as someone who lived in Alaska, I can tell you that is a long ass time to be living in the snowy mountains in the dead of winter. Thankfully though, most of the filming was done on the Universal lot, where the outside temperature was 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with the internal sets being climate controlled to 28 Fahrenheit. However, of course it didn't all stay here. Carpenter was determined to use authentic locations instead of sets. Thanks to his success on Halloween and The Fog, it gave him all the credibility he needed to get the job done, sending a scout out along the Canadian coast, which offered the project the scenic value. Sets were also constructed in Alaska during the summer atop a rocky overlook in preparation for snowfall to cover them. Now let's talk specifics. Facts that perhaps most of you had no idea about, such as the fact that a double amputee was used to create the film's quintessential special effect during filming. The memorable scene we're talking about is of course the scene where Norris's chest opens and Cooper's forearms disappear into the cavity. If you know, you know. So in order to pull this off, special effects designer Rob Bottin found a man who had lost both of his arms below the elbow in an industrial accident and fit him with two prosthetic forearms. The more you know. But I think the reason we're all here is to talk about The Thing. the actual Thing. The Thing is a shape-shifting creature that crash-landed upon Earth roughly 100,000 years ago. It was frozen in the ice of Antarctica and accidentally freed by the crew of Norway's Fuel Research Station, and in turn, it proceeded to attack and destroy. As a parasitic life form, the Thing seeks to absorb and assimilate any nearby life form, enabling it to gain shelter and be able to adapt to virtually any environment. One key capability of the creature is its ability to undergo cryogenic stasis, much like the Earth-native yeast fungus, which was what allowed it to lay dormant for 100,000 years. When the Thing engages another organism for assimilation, it rapidly generates a haphazard arrangement of limbs and body parts from its own biomass, with the shock and awe tactic proving effective as a hunting strategy. The consciousness of the creature is yet another mystery. All that can be certain is that it retains an inherited survival instinct and enough of the facets of the assimilated creature to pass convincingly as the original. Pretty much, when he assimilates, you'll never know. He looks like a human. And honestly, that is damn terrifying. If you've seen the film, you'll know. Now, this creature is absolutely horrifying to look at and of course took a long time to perfect. The Thing, by all accounts, was a physically grueling process, with Rob Bottin succumbing to exhaustion and having to be hospitalized. So in order to finish the laundry list of creature effects, he enlisted the help of Stan Winston to complete what turned out to be one of the movie's most stunning effects: the Thing itself. Now let's once again return to the negative feedback the film received upon its initial release. The overall impact on Carpenter was immediate. He lost his job on the 1984 science fiction horror film Firestarter due to the Thing's poor performance. He had a multiple film contract with Universal, but the studio opted to buy him out of it instead. However, he continued to make films following the poor reviews and did not openly talk about the critical failure until 1985, where he stated, I quote, "I was called a pornographer of violence. I had no idea it would be received that way. The Thing was just too strong for that time. I knew it was going to be strong, but I didn't think it would be too strong. I didn't take the public's taste into consideration." Shortly after these comments made by Carpenter, Wilbur Stark sued Universal for $43 million for slander, breach of contract, fraud, and deceit, alleging he incurred financial loss by Universal failing to credit him properly in its marketing and by showing his name during the end of the credits. However, let's jump forward in time. In the years following the release of The Thing, critics and fans began to reevaluate the film as a milestone of horror, with it now being called one of the greatest films of all time, with Empire magazine stating, I quote, "It is a peerless masterpiece of relentless suspense, retina-wrecking visual excess, and outright nihilistic terror." And finally, in 2011 interview, Carpenter remarked that it was close to, if not his favourite film from his own filmography. I quote, "If The Thing had been a hit, my career would have been different. I would have had to make the choices that I made, but I needed a job. I'm not saying that I hate the movies I did. I love making Christine and Starman and Big Trouble in Little China, all those films, but my career would have been different." The Thing has, of course, had significant impact on popular culture over the years, and by 1998, The Thing was already being deemed a cult classic. Throughout a variety of media, The Thing has been referred to, whether in The X-Files, Stranger Things, Resident Evil, Slither, or even The Mist. Folks are quick to want to include a small nod to one of the greatest horror films ever made. On top of that, several notable filmmakers have spoken out about their appreciation for The Thing and its influence on their own work, including Guillermo del Toro, David Robert Mitchell, and of course Quentin Tarantino. The film is also screened annually in February to mark the beginning of winter at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. As a result of the delayed success of The Thing, Dark Horse Comics published 4 comic book sequels starring McCready, which began back in 1991, with the two-part The Thing from Another World by Chuck Farrer, which is set 24 hours after the film. And in 2011, a prequel film, The Thing, was released to mixed reviews. It wasn't the best. It wasn't great. It had Mary Elizabeth Winstead, and that's all that was good. But let's discuss the ending of the original Thing, an ending which has been left up to viewer interpretation. McCready and Charles sharing a drink and watching the camp burn, knowing that one of them is The Thing. But which one? Well, it's been stated that not even director John Carpenter himself knows precisely which character is The Thing, and considering he's sadly gone, I guess we'll never know. Maybe they never intended for us to know. I'm okay with that. However, an alternate ending was actually filmed, just in case. John Carpenter and editor Todd Ramsey shot and cut an alternate ending to the film that was never used. According to Ramsey, they were concerned that the bleak, ambiguous ending would not test well with audiences, so Carpenter covered his bases and had a second ending ready to go. The second ending, and the one that was never seen, showed lead character McCready, played by Kurt Russell, being rescued and appears in a room where he is given a blood test to determine whether he has been assimilated, which he passes. However, thankfully we never got that ending, and personally I love the ambiguity of the original. Also, I hope that alternate ending doesn't confirm that McCready wasn't the Thing. Either way, I don't care. The Thing is by far one of the greatest films of all time and ranked numerous times as one of the top films you have to see before you die. It's exciting, it's scary, it's fun, but better yet, it's a trailblazer in the horror genre, proving that some things just need time. The Thing was a film before its time, but found its much desired audience a few years later, and quickly became a cult classic amongst movie lovers. To this day, no creature will be as terrifying to me as The Thing, because, as the film states, you never know where it may be, or who it may be. Can you trust the person next to you, your family, partner, friends? Can you even trust yourself? No. Well, there we have it. What are your thoughts on The Thing? And what movie would you like us to cover next on It Came From the 80s? Leave us all your thoughts and feelings in the comments down below. If you haven't already, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another scary vid. And until next time, see you later. Welcome back to It Came From the 80s over here on Top 5 Scary Videos. You guys seem to love this series and that makes me so very happy because discussing horror, specifically 80s horror, is perhaps one of my favorite things. But today is a special day because we get to talk about one of the greatest horror movies of all time from one of the kings of horror, Clive Barker. Yep, that's right, this is It Came From the 80s, Hellraiser. Released in 1987, Hellraiser is based upon the novella The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker, who also wrote the screenplay and directed the film. Not only did the film quickly become a horror trailblazer, but it also marked Clive Barker's directorial debut, an impressive debut at that. The film itself follows a man named Frank who opens the door to an alternate dimension and has his body torn to pieces by creatures known as the Cenobytes. Years later though, Frank's brother Larry moves into the now abandoned home with his new wife Julia, who accidentally triggers Frank's resurrection. The movie is wonderfully bloody and crosses boundaries not many had up until that point, particularly diving into sadomasochism and goth culture in horror movies. Now, having been dismayed by prior adaptations of his work, Barker decided to take a jab at directing the movie himself, with the help of Christopher Figg, who agreed to produce, and New World Pictures, who funded the film for $900,000. Production began at the end of 1986 and was made in just 9 to 10 weeks, which is insane. Tracking back to our earlier point about BDSM, the film's working title was actually Sadomasochists from Beyond the Grave, with Barker also toying with the idea of naming the movie Hellbound until Christopher Figg suggested Hellraiser, probably for the best. But let's get to the meat of this video, the reason we're all here, the Cenobites. Cenobites are extra-dimensional beings who appear in the novella The Hellbound Heart, the sequels, and of course in the 10 Hellraiser movies. That's right, 10. They are theologians from a religious sect in hell known as the Order of the Gash, describing themselves as explorers in the further regions of experience, and granting sadomasochistic pleasure to those who call upon them. That's right, like I said before, this film is quite literally about pleasure and pain and the boundary that exists between. Now, of course, like most graphic horror movies purely centered on pain and torture, the movie had to make a few cuts after MPAA gave it an X rating. The scenes that were cut are as follows, spoilers ahead if you haven't seen the film. 2.5 shots were excised from the first hammer murder, including a close-up of the hammer lodged in the victim's head. In the scene where Julia murders another man, the actor playing the victim felt that it made more sense for him to do so naked, which I know the scene we're talking about here, but he didn't really need to be naked. The nude murder scene was shot, but ultimately replaced with the semi-clothed version. Close-ups of Kirsty sticking her hand into Frank's stomach, exposing his guts. Longer version of the scene where Frank is being torn into pieces by the Cenobites' hooks. Final shot where his head explodes and his brain messily splashes out was also cut. Now, Barker faced a lot of problems regarding censorship, stating in an interview for Samhain magazine, I quote, "Well, we did have a slight problem with the eroticism. I shot a much hotter flashback sequence than they would allow us to cut in. Mine was more explicit and less violent. They wanted to substitute one line of undertow for another. I had a much more explicit sexual encounter between Frank and Julia, but they said no, let's take out the sodomy and put in the flick knife." Oh boy, sodomy. Yeah. The movie was first released in the United States on September 18, 1987 and grossed $14 million in the US and Canada. However, a fact I didn't know was that it was initially banned in Ontario by the Ontario Film and Video Review Board. By a majority vote of 3-2, the film was deemed not approved in its entirety as it contravenes community standards due to its, I quote, brutal graphic violence with bloodletting throughout, horror, degradation, and torture. However, in August of 1987, the movie was finally passed by the board after several cuts were made to the film. New World Mutual Pictures of Canada were forced to cut around 40 seconds to get the film passed with an R rating. 35 seconds of an extended torture scene featuring hooks pulling apart a body and face were removed, as well as the scene of the squirming rats nailed to a wall. Though saying that, I rewatched Hellraiser the other day and I specifically recall the rats, so liars? Of course, opinions were torn upon the release of the movie. Reviews hailing from London, particularly in Time Out London magazine, referred to the film as, I quote, Barker's dazzling debut that creates such an atmosphere of dread that the astonishing set pieces simply detonate in a chain reaction of cumulative intensity, and concluded that the film was a serious, intelligent, and disturbing horror film. Melody Maker would even go on to describe it as the best horror film ever to be made in Britain. However, not everyone agreed, of course, with many critics in the US panning the movie. Q stated, I quote, Hellraiser does have its share of problems, the redubbing of peripheral character with a mid-Atlantic twang, and the relocation of the film in a geographical limbo. The New York Times would go on to state that Barker cast singularly uninteresting characters, while the special effects aren't bad, only damp. Yikes. I mean, damp certainly isn't a compliment. Personally though, some of the special effects haven't aged wonderfully. Hellraiser is still one of the most effective movies out there. I mean, the engineer is by far one of the scariest monsters ever created, and the Cenobytes themselves are enough to keep you up at night. But what makes the movie so superb is the lore itself, the minute detailing around the lament configuration, the appearances of the Cenobytes, their entire existence centering on pain and torture. It's all so original and raw, something we rarely get to see these days. In the early 2010s, Time Out conducted a poll with several authors, directors, actors, and critics alike who have worked within the horror genre to vote for their top horror films. Hellraiser placed at number 80 on their top 100 list. Personally, I would have placed it higher because as iconic as this movie is, it sadly seems to be underrated, even among horror lovers. Sadly, like all great movies, it was announced that a remake would be coming back in 2006. However, for a handful of years, directors signed on and off, with many not being able to agree on a script or leaving due to creative differences. In 2013, Clive Barker himself stated that he would personally be writing the remake of the original Hellraiser, and that he had already completed a deal with Dimension Films' Bob Weinstein. Yikes. He also went on to state that he would be pushing for practical effects rather than CGI, and that the original Pinhead, Doug Bradley, would be reprising the role. Exciting, right? Well, the remake never surfaced, with Barker revealing in 2017 that the script was written and delivered to Dimension years ago. That was the last anyone heard until news of Hellraiser Judgment surfaced. Now this is where things get fishy, because when I read this my blood boiled. As stated, Clive Barker wanted to write and direct the remake himself, considering he wrote the novella and directed the original film. He has every right. Well, after he sent off the script for the remake, he heard nothing until Hellraiser Judgment was released in 2018, a movie which Clive Barker had nothing to do with. Written and directed by the original special makeup effects artist Gary J. Tunnicliffe, the film centers on three police detectives who, investigating a series of murders, are confronted by the denizens of hell. Now of course the film was a flop, with it going straight to DVD, scoring 2.8 out of 5. That's what you get. However, back to the original. Thanks to the reaction to Doug Bradley's performance of the lead Cenobite, it aided in the huge wave of popularity for the movie in the video release market, leading the character to be dubbed Pinhead, and the release of a further 7 sequels, 3 of which were cinematic releases that managed to roughly gross around 40 million in combined domestic takings. As of right now, the film holds a steady 63% on Rotten Tomatoes. I mean, deserves higher, but this is Rotten Tomatoes we're talking about here. They hate everything, like me. Overall, Hellraiser will forever remain one of the greatest horror movies in my opinion, especially one of the greatest supernatural horror movies, with Pinhead becoming one of the most iconic movie villains in history, even though he's not really a villain, but I don't want to get into that right now. now. Though, like I previously mentioned, the dubbing can be distracting, the overall acting, special effects, and superior story is what makes you keep coming back for more. I love you, Pinhead. Well, there we have it. You guys fans of Hellraiser? Let us know in the comments down below. Before I go though, I just want to respond to a few comments from one of our last videos. Top 5 real hauntings from around the world. Travis Cook said, if Lucy is a siren, I would definitely crash my boat when I hear her. Well, shucks, how sweet of you. More souls to take. Pazuzu said, big fan of Lucy, Morticia Addams meets Emma Bunting. Well, thank you, I appreciate that, but personally I was always a fan of Ginger Spice. I never liked Baby Spice. A beautiful Twisted Mind said, after watching Queen Lucy in that hoodie, I have a sudden urge to play Twister. You game, Lucy? I'm always game. I respect that. Hershenia Rivera Loridio said, tell me about yourself, Lucy. Hi, I'm Lucy. That's all you need to know. And on that note, if you haven't already, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another scary vid. And until next time, see you later. Hey guys, welcome back to It Came From the 80's, the series here on Top 5 Scary where we do a deep dive into some of the greatest horror movies from the decade and examine what exactly made them so good. Today we are discussing The Fly, but before we do that, be sure to stick around until the end of the video where I'll be responding to some of your comments. And with that, let's jump into It Came From the 80's, The Fly. Released in 1986, The Fly is a science fiction body horror movie directed and co-produced by the legendary filmmaker David Cronenberg, and is loosely based on George Langeland's 1957 short story of the same name. The film tells the story of an eccentric scientist who, after one of his experiments goes wrong, slowly turns into a fly hybrid creature. Not the best case scenario. The film stars a stellar cast including Jeff Goldblum, Gina Davis, John Getz, and even Cronenberg himself. Production first kicked off in the early 1980s when co-producer Kip Oman approached screenwriter Charles Edward Pogue with an idea of remaking the classic science fiction horror film The Fly, which had been released all the way back in the 50s. The pair moved forward, writing an initial screenplay and approaching Cronenberg, who was no longer associated with Total Recall, in turn making him available. He loved the idea and agreed to sign on as a director if he would be allowed to rewrite the script. And that he did, and I think we're all very happy about that decision. But let's talk creature design and makeup, the reason we're all here. The Academy Award winning makeup was designed and executed by Chris Wallace over a period of just 3 months. He first designed the final stage of the Brundlefly before filling in the gaps needed to carry protagonist Seth Brundle to that final incarnation. Now, what most folks might not know is that the transformation was intended to be a metaphor for the aging process. Something I didn't even know. So, saying that Brundle loses his hair, teeth, and fingernails, with his skin becoming discolored and lumpy over time. The general intention was to give Brundle a bruised and cancerous look that gets progressively worse, with the final Brundlefly hybrid creature literally bursting out of Brundle's hideously deteriorated human skin. More interesting still, the transformation process was broken up into 7 distinct stages, with Jeff Goldblum spending many hours in the makeup chair. And I'm gonna break down those stages right now. Stage 1 and 2, subtle rash-like skin discoloration that leads to facial lesions and sores, with many fly hairs dotting Goldblum's face, in addition to the patch of fly hairs growing out of the wound on Brundle's back. Stages 3 and 4A, piecemeal prosthetics covering Goldblum's face, wigs with bald spots, and crooked prosthetic teeth. Stage 4B, deleted from the film, this variant of Stage 4 was seen only in the monkey cast scene, and required Goldblum to wear the first of 2 full body foam latex suits, as Brundle has stopped wearing clothing at this point. Stage 5, the second full body suit with more exaggerated deformities, and which also required Goldblum to wear distorting contact lenses that made one eye look larger than the other. Stage 6, the final Brundlefly creature depicted by various partial and full body cable and rod controlled puppets. Stage 7, another puppet, which represented the mortally injured Brundlefly telepod fusion creature as seen in the film's final moments. How cool is that? Insane, right? Upon release, unlike a lot of horror movies that hailed from the 80's, aka a lot of the films we've covered on this series so far, the movie was instantly critically acclaimed, with most of the praise going to Goldblum's performance and of course the special effects department. The film in turn was a commercial success and the biggest of Cronenberg's career. Another surprise, with the movie being the top grossing film in the United States for 2 weeks, earning a total domestic gross of $40 million. Of course, like many others, Cronenberg was surprised at the success of The Fly, and the acclaim handed to it by critics, with the film even being seen by some critics as a cultural metaphor for AIDS, since he originally intended the film to be a more general analogy for disease itself, terminal conditions like cancer, and more specifically the aging process. I quote, "If you or your lover has AIDS, you watch that film, and of course you'll see AIDS in it, but you don't have to have that experience to respond emotionally to the movie." And I think that's really its power. This is not to say that AIDS didn't have an incredible impact on everyone, and of course after a certain point people were seeing AIDS stories everywhere, so I don't take any offense that people see that in my movie. For me though, there was something about the Fly story that was much more universal. Aging and death, something all of us have to deal with. On top of that, the quote, "Be afraid, be very afraid," was also used as the film's marketing tagline, and became so ingrained in pop culture that a large number of people had no idea that it's affiliated with the movie. The film holds a 92% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with the consensus reading, I quote, "David Cronenberg combines his trademark affinity for gore and horror with strongly developed characters, making The Fly a surprisingly affecting tragedy." Not too shabby. In 2005, Time magazine film critics Roger Carlis and Richard Schickel included The Fly in their list of the all-time 100 greatest movies, with Time later naming it one of the 25 best horror films of all time. The Fly was such a success at the time, it was nominated for a slew of awards, including Best Makeup, Best Dramatic Presentation, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Horror Film, and of course, Best Directing. Now, there was a sequel, which I really don't want to talk about because it was a complete and utter train wreck, with Cronenberg having no involvement whatsoever in the project. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me, considering the impact it had on the Fly series as a whole, but I'm sticking by my point. Then in March 2015, IDW Publishing released a 5-issue comic book miniseries titled The Fly Outbreak, written by Brandon Seifert, with the story being a direct sequel to the events of The Fly 2, and features Seth Brundle's son, Martin, inadvertently causing transgenic outbreak while attempting to cure Anton Bartok, to whom he'd previously transferred his mutant genes at the end of The Fly 2. So, I guess if you want to read it, you have to watch The Fly 2. I'm sorry. All in all, David Cronenberg may be one of the greatest contemporary auteurs of our time, with The Fly being by far one of the most influential horror movies, as well as one of the most successful. It's a remarkable body horror that shows off groundbreaking special effects that deservedly won numerous Oscars. And Cronenberg does, as Seth Brundle suggests, "I build bodies, I take them apart and put them back together again." Ain't that the truth? The Fly is Cronenberg's most embossed work, offering up a terrifying possibility. The body revolting against the mind, with the mind unable to assemble the control. So damn chilling. Well, there we have it. Do you guys agree with our video? What horror movies from the 80s do you want us to cover next on It Came From the 80s? Leave us all your thoughts and feelings in the comments down below. Before I go though, I just want to respond to a few comments from one of our last videos. Top 5 worst horror movie sequels of all time, part 2. 1 million subscribers with one video said, "Haven't seen the video yet, but I already know Troll 2 is going to be on the list." And you would be right, you guys demanded it and I fulfilled your wishes. You're welcome. No one likes Troll 2. The Dank Savage said, "I'd like to see Ash from the Evil Dead open the Hellraiser box in Camp Crystal Lake while dreaming." That's a crossover none of us could possibly prepare for, but I'm here for it. Completely here for it. Super Rockstar said, "Seriously, you look good as Pinhead. Like really good." Excuse me? That's an insult. Darkblade said, "Women who like Hellraiser do exist. I mean, there are women out there who love horror. Maybe I'm a rare breed. Who is a sucker for the Hellraiser franchise? I don't think so. I think everyone loves Hellraiser. It's amazing." And on that note, if you haven't already, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another scary vid. And until next time, see you later.